We gotta think about worship in a more expansive way, because that's what it is. It's doing more than we know because God is doing more than we know. The powers and principalities are actually, we're faithfully proclaiming the gospel, knowing that they are paying attention.
What does worship actually do? Welcome to the 10,000 Fathers and Mothers podcast. We are a community of worship pastors and leaders committed to raising and releasing spiritual mothers and fathers who creatively shape the future of the church. The primary way we do this is through our worship school that happens twice a year here in Colorado Springs or online. Be sure to check out our website, 10kfam.org, to learn more about the school, as well as the dates for the next intensive. Now let's jump into the podcast. For many of you, it's something that you do every week. You've probably built your life around it. There is an entire industry built around it. But if someone walked up to you after church on a Sunday morning and asked you the question, what's the point of worship? What does it actually do? Who is it for? Would you be able to answer that question well? Our team actually recently did some research on what the most common questions that people were typing into Google were around this idea of worship. And those were some of the most common questions that people were asking, right alongside things like searching worship leader outfits and worship leader appreciation day, which, guys, to be honest, I didn't even know was a thing. But I'm also being told that it's every Monday morning from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. Just a little heads up. So I'm really excited about this topic that we're going to talk about today. We're going to dive into some of these questions, which seem basic, but are actually kind of hard to answer for many of us. My name is Lauren Sedembrini. I'm the executive director of 10K Fam, and I'm joined today by Jonathan Swindal. Jonathan is on our team. He is also a graduate of 10K Fam Worship School, and he does many things around the 10K Fam Worship School, everything from recruiting, accounting. He also teaches a lot of our core content, helps us develop new content, and he's been a worship pastor for many years, and now is actually the associate lead pastor of New Life Midtown, which is a local church here in Colorado Springs where my husband and I actually attend. So Jonathan is one of our pastors. He and his wife, Bonnie, have been massive blessings and gifts in our life and just good friends of ours. So I'm really happy to have him joining on the podcast today. Very excited personally about this conversation. I think it's going to be really interesting, and I hope it's a gift to you as well. So I want to start by asking just the question, were these search engine results surprising to you?
Particularly the one about worship leader appreciation. That was exciting to me.
Yeah.
But
same.
Yeah, well, I think it's a yes and no, because if we're giving people the benefit of a doubt, they could be just curious what other people are saying, or they have their own opinions, but they want to see what blogs or YouTube videos are out there. So on the one hand, it's not super surprising. I hope that we are always thinking about what is worship, who is worship for, what is it doing. But on the other side, I think there is the potential that what we know about the worship leader, quote unquote, industry or worship pastors in churches is that there was a really big shift, I don't know, a couple of decades ago, where worship leaders and worship pastors came into their positions differently than a lot of senior pastors. Many people were promoted into positions, ended up getting full-time jobs just because they were actually talented and skilled, could play an instrument, could sing, and had a gift on their life. But many of them never went to seminary. Matter of fact, I think most have not gone to seminary. And many of them probably came up in the same kind of churches they were raised in, then started leading worship in those same kind of churches. So if you were raised in rural Kansas in a Methodist church, then you moved to Minnesota, you just looked for First United Methodist Church, right? So you're not always asking questions about or being exposed to the way that other people are doing these things. So it does tell me there's probably a gap somewhere underneath how do we do what we do in the why we do what we do. I think it does at least tell us that much.
Sure. Okay. So just so that people can get a feel for your history, tell us a bit about your church background, growing up, why you're so passionate about this topic of worship.
Yeah, I was raised in old school Assembly of God churches in Florida, medium-sized and then large churches. My grandparents attended, and my dad was raised in the First Assembly of God Church in the state of Florida, which was birthed as a holiness church and then became an Assembly of God church. So it's varied, but it is all Pentecostal, classical Pentecostal, which is different than a lot of the AG churches that you go to now, and they look like every other non-denominational evangelical church. So, for instance, the church that I have the most memories in, we had a 100-piece choir, 15-piece orchestra. My dad was the minister of music for most of my life. In that same church of about 3,000 people in South Florida, we would have, I don't know, maybe every other week, tongues and interpretation live in the service. Every service. And we did have 2 Sunday morning services and a Sunday night service and a Wednesday night service on top of all the rehearsals with annual revivals, all of those things, of course. I remember frequently the first service would still be going, or at least at the altar, when the second service would start. So worship at the front end, praise at the front end, more worship at the second end, if we're using, colloquial understandings of those words, like the fast, upbeat songs in the beginning, the slow, contemplative songs at the end. Altar calls frequently, gifts of the Spirit, laying on of hands, anointing with oil, all every Sunday morning, night, Wednesday night, and in youth group, honestly. So for me, worship is a big deal because my dad was the minister of music. That's what they used to be called, by the way, the minister of music. And I have vivid memories as young as, 7 or 8 years old of my dad sitting at the grand or baby grand piano at the church, and me, when I was real young, sitting next to him on the piano bench at these lingering at the altar, tarry at the altar services. And then as I got a little older, I would sit in my own chair right behind him. But I have so many memories, and those are some of the sweetest memories I have of, between me and my dad, but also the history of the Pentecostal churches that I grew up in. It's very fond memories for me, and most of them revolve around worship. So then I get into high school and start playing on the worship teams, and then get into college and I'm in traveling groups. So even when I tried to do other things like business, worship ended up just kind of pulling me back into what seems to be the trajectory of my life now in ministry. So from the time I was born to now, it has always been central to how I relate to God, to how I relate to God's people, and even how I relate to my family, because my dad was a minister of music most of my life growing up.
It's amazing to me that we have ended up in the same church now, because my history growing up in church could not be more opposite from that. I grew up in the United Methodist Church in my elementary and middle school years, and it was the kind of church where on Sunday morning we were singing out of hymnals, and you'd have the numbers like listed on the wall, choir robes, and we're I learned how to read music from a very early age because we're all standing there like literally nose glued to the hymn book, just singing the songs. And then I think we didn't get into like more contemporary expressions of worship until my family switched over into the non-denominational space, somewhere in my late middle school, early high school years. And really it wasn't until I was in my 20s, honestly, coming through worship school was kind of the first time that I venturing more into like Holy Spirit kind of. So yeah, it's been a completely different journey for me. And I think the thing that I'm realizing is just how different it's like. Here we are reading the same Bible, all trying to, faithfully understand like what does it mean to worship. We're all worshiping the same God, all loving the same Jesus, and somehow our expressions of doing that all look so vastly different. So what do you think's going on there?
I think a lot is going on. I mean, ultimately, to me, most of it goes back to biblical interpretation, but even just thinking about how we got here with, what do they say, some 31,000 denominations of churches in the world. I mean, it's an astronomical number. And to think at one time, not well, over 1,000 years ago, there were 2 churches, and before that there was 1 church. So we've splintered fast. Like, this is the first MLM, like where just splintering left and right and building the tree as wide as we possibly can with denominations at the bottom. But, it's interesting that there is interpretation, but also we put weight down on different verses and different passages, even different books of the Bible, right? So the Pentecostals, Acts is incredibly important. Revelation is really important, often in a very misunderstood way. And then you have other streams of the church where it's just the different ways of emphasizing different things, even that Paul said, right? So Paul, the same guy, we have churches that really emphasize things like Paul's household codes and completely ignore that Paul says that I speak in tongues more than all of you in his passages about the gifts of the Spirit. And so how is it that one guy who can talk about dogma in 1st and 2nd Timothy and how important right doctrine is the same guy who talks about the gifts of the Spirit and orderly worship, and the same guy who talks about household codes and how slaves and masters relate? But you very rarely find churches where all of those carry the same weight. And I'm not even suggesting that they should. But what ends up happening in the Protestant Reformation is that you have individual leaders trying to reform, and eventually, Luther and Calvin and then Zwingli, and then later on with like John Wesley, we have these individual, mostly men, who have very strong theological opinions and then end up birthing denominations unintentionally. So just like all of us, they have personalities, they have preferences, they have their own history, their own way of reading the text and what they read into the text. So inevitably, we have denominations that some of them are more geared toward heady people. We have denominations that are geared more toward flowy, spontaneous, emotive and expressive, right? So on the one hand, it kind of makes sense, though I wish that there wasn't so much irony in all of it. Just this last week, I had someone approach me, and the first words out of their mouth were that they wish the church could just do away with all denominations and just get back to reading the Bible together again. And then 90 seconds later, they said something that was incredibly controversial in the political realm. So I think a lot of it is that people are just oblivious that there are other Christians that are doing their best to faithfully read the text who come to vastly different endpoints when they're doing so. That's part of how we get to where we are, or from where we came from, right? So there's a lot there, but I think ultimately it all comes back to how we read the text and how we are faithfully pursuing what we are interpreting to be faithful readings of the text. So
right. It is an interesting thing to observe that people tend to be so opinionated about the worship and their particular expression of what that looks like in their church. And sometimes they try to use like theological, arguments to justify that. And sometimes it tends to be, not theological at all. Sometimes it's just opinion. But worship tends to be something that like it can make or break the reason that somebody chooses a church or, one church down the road or another church down the road. So it does seem like there is an interesting like opportunity though, that people are asking this question, like, what is worship really about? It does seem like there is an opportunity for us to, bring some kind of unity to our understanding of like, what's actually going on here? What are we actually all after? We are actually all after the same thing, right? Yeah.
I hope we're all after the same thing. And there are vastly different interpretations. And what I'm about to share, I got from Glenn Packiam initially, so I want to make sure to give him credit. But Glenn talks about these three predominant frameworks: encounter, formation, and mission, that historically, at least from the Protestant Reformation to this point, churches tend to fall into one of these three paradigms or frameworks. Encounter is believing that the primary reason that the people of God gather is to encounter God. And there is the Pentecostal charismatic version of that. And then there's the sacramental version where that happens through bread and wine at the table, right? And then there is formation, which the formation primarily Reformed, not exclusively, but believe that the reason that we gather is to be shaped in the image of God. And in those churches, you're going to find, content is king. Content is everything. So pretty much everything is scripted, and it's not very emotive. It's very cerebral. Then we have mission, which has always been a part of the church, but then we got to the quote unquote seeker sensitive churches that mostly popped up around the 80s, maybe a little bit before that. And in their mind, it is to proclaim the gospel to the unbeliever. So the underlying belief there is like, get people into the doors of the church on Sunday morning where we are sure they will hear the gospel, and discipleship can happen in any other venue later throughout the week, in homes, classes, et cetera, et cetera. And I think Glenn is largely correct in his diagnosis. And what I've come to believe is that on some level, if we're not attempting to hold all three of those in some kind of dynamic tension, then we're really missing a huge part about what worship really is. Because you have to say, on some level, worship is about all three of those things. It is about encountering God directly and through table and through word and in prayer and through neighbor, through one another, his people. It is about being formed in the image of Jesus Christ, both individually, but also as a corporate entity, a corporate body. Entity is probably not the best word. And then it is also about mission, which my understanding of mission is about discovering and discerning where God is at work and responding to his invitation to partner with that. So constantly asking the question, God, where are you at work in this person's life? What are you doing? How can I be like a midwife and usher along your work? So I do think faithful worship, most people would say they think that all three of those should be a part of it, but it's really hard work to hold them in a dynamic tension and be pursuing them all at the same time. It's just easier to go, it's primarily about encounter. Like if the other things happen, great, or formation or mission, right? So I think that's a big part of it, is that we fail to see that this is multifaceted and multidimensional.
Yeah, and I imagine like most things, it's like, your church community or even your leadership is probably going to, more naturally lean in one or two of those directions than the other. And you kind of have to be very aware of those leanings and very intentionally try to lean in the directions that maybe you're less naturally leaning in. Absolutely. And so I think that language is very helpful for those of you listening to think through, where does your community lean naturally? And then maybe what's a good challenge for you to think through, where could you be leaning or where could you be working towards? And I like the language that you're using too about the dynamic tension of like, it's not about like having a perfect balance between all three of those. That's not really the goal.
It's impossible.
Right. Like, It's like, what would that even look like?
Right.
It's always just like ebb and flow, but always aiming to be having all three of them as an expression that you're seeing over the course of the life of your church. Yep. Okay. So that's really helpful language. So, and that's kind of touching on what is worship about. And some of that is helping us get into this idea of like, what is worship actually doing? Yeah. So let's get into that question. So what does worship actually do? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, this is a great question. Is this a trap? No, it's not a trap. Yeah, I mean, on the surface, worship is for God. I think that's the Sunday school answer. But I think if we want to go a little bit deeper, it would be faithful to say, like throughout the trajectory of Scripture, what we see is that God has a way of everything that we give to him, he turns back around and gives to us as a resource. Because what God is after is he's not narcissistic. He's not after self-inflating and making himself self-important, What God is after is communion with his people. So I do think it's also faithful to say, faithful worship is always unto God. But when that happens, it's actually a gift that God has given to us as a way to draw us into the life that we are called to live. So there's a way in which worship is for the people of God. Worship is also for creation, for the powers and principalities, a way of speaking to them and proclaiming. Ultimately, worship is unto God, but what worship is rightly recognizing what God has done and responding to it. So our response draws us into who God is and what God has done. So I also think there's a way in which worship is for us, as heretical as that sounds on the surface. But I think that's faithful to say. I think that's right to say.
Yes. What I'm hearing you say is like God has commanded us to worship because he knows that's what we need.
Right. Yeah. What we need is to be rightly aligned with him.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, because you hear people say, I don't know, I've heard people say all the time, like, humans are going to worship, like, we're going to worship something.
Yes,
so,
right.
And so worship.
We're worshiping beings.
We are worshiping beings.
Yeah.
And so worshiping God is what helps, like, keep our heart aligned where it should be.
Right. Exactly. Him. Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, Jamie Smith has done a lot of work on that. You Are What You Love. And he's written a trilogy of other books about imagining the kingdom and all of that. And really his focus in all of it is that we are always worshiping. So our hearts being rightly oriented in worship is of utmost importance. And the way that happens is by our affections being turned toward God through participation of habits and practices. And so I think that's what we see. So think like biblically, does God need us to clap? Does God need us to sing? Of course not. God doesn't need any of those things. And it's not like our singing or our clapping actually exalts God or magnifies God in the sense that when we do those things, we're not changing God at all. We're not making God more worthy. Yeah. Or when we say we magnify you, Lord, we're not actually making God bigger. Mm-hmm. That God can't get any bigger. God is who God is, right? Yeah. But what we are doing is we are over our lives, over the atmosphere, over our congregation, our family, the space. We are proclaiming what is ultimately true, and what is being changed is us. We are being brought into alignment. Our problems, all the good and the bad of our lives, are being ordered more rightly as we worship. So I think that's a way of getting at it. Okay, that's good. So you've hit on a couple things that talk about what worship does. And I want to get to that in a minute. But first, I want to go back to something that you said about like worship being for us. And something that's happened over the last few decades is we're getting so many more worship songs that seem to be about us and ours. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are. Like, how is that impacting our worship when so many of our worship songs seem to be us expressing like our own emotions and our own thoughts and our own feelings? Yeah. Like, how is that playing into what's going on? Oh man, I think there's a lot to say here, and take all of this with a grain of salt because you did ask my thoughts. So these are just my thoughts. Yeah. There are multiple camps out there. Some of the camps are typically a little more on the Reformed side of things, which are, we need to be singing objective truth about who God is. And of course that is true. But if what worship is responding to who God is, then there is a part of worship that is our self-expression. So think about the story of David dancing, or Mary pouring her nard, or the other story, I forget which one of them is named Mary and which one is a woman, but one of them pours oil and the other one washes Jesus' feet with her hair. All of those are doing multiple things, but they are all expression from deep within the heart of the individual that manifest physically. So I don't think it's at all wrong to talk about and in worship acknowledge the realities of our own life and the way that we are responding. I'm going to sing, I'm going to shout, or whatever. The problem becomes when those things become more inflated than the objective truth or the God who we're singing about. So if we are responding to God, at some point we got to talk about who this God is that we're responding to. If all I'm ever doing is talking about how I feel, then it's really easy to get really off course in worship. And Robert Weber and a number of other people have talked about what the gathering is ultimately about is getting the gospel told, or telling the story of the gospel, or proclaiming the story, which, if we think about it in that light, it's less about our expression, though in some ways, whoever's doing that, whoever is telling the story, whether through song or through a sermon or the table, some self-expression is going to come through. And I think God delights in that. I don't think God is going, get yourself out of it, make it all about me.
Sure.
I think God designed us so that when we tell his story, I mean, that's what the Bible is, right? God didn't drop the Bible from heaven. He lets his children tell the story. And so there's a part of it where I think God delights in us being real with our own gifts and our own self-expression. I think that's beautiful. It just can't overshadow the story of what God has done in Christ. I think when we only ever have one, I think we're just being a little myopic and we're not really wrestling in the dynamic tension. But it is important that we don't let what we're going to do overshadow what God has done. I think at the end of it, that's what's most important.
Yeah. I guess if you put that framework of the formation, encounter, mission on top of it, could you think of it in terms of formation would be the objective truth songs, and the encounter would be the subjective songs that are more talking about our expression, and then I don't know, I guess mission would almost be
invitation songs.
Yeah, and even through the lens of if you if someone who is not a believer, seeker, goes to a church and they're only encountering songs that are all about our feelings and all that, they're never actually hearing the truth of what God's done.
Right.
And so it's kind of okay, well, what are these people are really, they're feeling a lot. And I see that, and that's really awesome. But also what, about what, what's happening here?
Exactly.
So anyway, that's,
very much. And there's a lot of talk about emotion in worship right now too. And not just right now, for the last, at least 10 years. And I think this is another area where actually Glenn Packiam has written on this. He's a really helpful thinker and pastor and wonderful person, especially in the realm of worship. But it's too easy to just dismiss emotion. We have to recognize that emotion is also a gift to us, that God made us the way that we are. Emotions are not a result of the fall. So emotion in worship is not something that we need to seek to avoid. Emotion in worship should and does play a role in encounters. But just like we talked about earlier, if we only ever have 1/3 of this pie, then are we really faithfully proclaiming the gospel? And I would say no. I think you need at least those three. And there might be other things that we just haven't thought about yet. But it's about encountering God, or it's actually about God encountering us, if we're going to be right about it. Us being formed in the image of God, and us seeking God's activity to partner with it as mission, So, yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, so the third question that we introduced at the beginning of this podcast that you've hit on a little bit, but that I do want to intentionally get to, is this idea of explicitly stating what does worship actually do?
Yeah. There's probably a lot to be said here on the physiological realm of what worship does in a person that I'm not really qualified to speak to, but I know that there are some people doing some good work there. I think at least worship does a few things congregationally. It reorients the congregation around whatever you're singing around.
Sure.
Hopefully that is the triune God. But let's just not assume that we're going to sing all songs that are my response to God. And because we all have God in mind, we're being reoriented around God. What worship does, you said earlier that everybody is worshiping. What worship does is it draws you somewhere. So if you're worshiping money, if you're worshiping fame, talent, whatever, it orients your heart and therefore your life and all of who you are toward that end. So ideally, worship in a congregational sense, faithfully done, is reorienting us toward God, and both individually and corporately. So there's a galvanizing aspect to it congregationally. There's a faith encouraging aspect of it. We should recognize that every Sunday we have people who are coming off the worst week of their lives, people who are coming off the best week of their lives, and probably like 75% or more, it's just a normal week, right? So we're bringing all of that into that space where we need to be reoriented. I think there's also an element that is happening in a realm that we can't see, and I think it's Psalm 138 that speaks to this. I'd have to check notes to verify, but it's before the gods I will sing my praise. And there is this element, and Paul talks about this, and it's either Philippians or Colossians or Ephesians or Colossians, where the powers and principalities are actually, we're faithfully proclaiming the gospel, knowing that they are paying attention. Okay. And we also see this in the book of Revelation. There's a way of reading Revelation that I think is faithful. I think it's right, where it's in the face of empire that is violent, that is coercive, that is manipulative, that the way that the church stays faithful is not by fighting back, but by faithfully worshiping, by turning our eyes toward God and even toward one another. There's this passage, I think it's Revelation 4, where it's like the elders proclaim and the creatures fall down. It's like the creatures are paying attention to the revelation that the elders are receiving, and they are overcome with the holiness of God. So in all of this, the corporate nature really matters too. Like, you see God in a way that I don't see God. And if we genuinely believe that about the people that we're worshiping with, that there is something happening beyond what all of us can recognize, that our souls, that our spirits need. We need to not just do this alone. We should do it alone. But we also need to do this weekly together, because there's something that is happening before the gods, Psalm 138, that we are part of the Big C church, and we are proclaiming the story of the gospel from the welcome and the call to worship all the way to the table and the sending, that there is something happening in a spiritual realm that none of us can really explain, but we have to acknowledge that there is a mystery there, and worship is doing something that we can't put our fingers on.
Yeah, I think it's really easy for us to forget how powerful it is in that way.
Yep.
Especially when we do this, like especially those of us who have been in the worship leader seat, like we are used to feeling the like weekly grind of like, oh, we got to get that set list up on PCO. We got, like we got to make sure we got a drummer this week, whatever, like we're in that space. And I think it's really easy for us to forget that this thing we do every week, it actually it has an impact that is eternal, and that it's so powerful and so mysterious that we can't even fully wrap our minds around.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
It's
like the premise of all of worship is that God is better than I imagine, and God is doing more than I'm aware of. And that is why we can come in, and people whose lives are saying otherwise, they're experiencing otherwise, they're coming in with eyes of hope, because we're trusting and believing that what the scriptures say, what the history of the church say, and what the people around us say is that God is better than we know. He is trustworthy, and he's doing more than you can see. And that's why when we're down, we can come into the space of worship and we can worship faithfully without leaving all our baggage at the door. We can do that because those are the fundamental foundational things that we believe to be true about God. And it's easy to forget those things when we're worried about tracks and lighting and all the stuff, which I'm not suggesting is unimportant. But if we're not fixing our eyes on the transcendent part of worship, if we're just thinking about what do I need this week based on what I experienced Monday through Saturday, then that's really myopic and we're missing a lot. Like, we gotta think about worship in a more expansive way, because that's what it is. It's doing more than we know because God is doing more than we know. And worship is the moment, corporate worship, particularly the Sunday morning worship gathering, is the moment when we're all stepping to attention and participating, not just with all of our activities, which are worshipful, like our jobs and leading our homes, those things are worshipful. But now we are participating in the worship of the Big C church. And there is a distinction there. And I'm not an expert on it, but I've read enough to be convinced that there is something unique about that Sunday morning gathering that we just can't explain all of what's happening. What we need to do is participate. We need to respond to what God has done and what the people of God have been doing for 2,000 years, though how they've been doing it is different and dynamic and varied. Hopefully, if we are worshiping the God revealed Father, Son, and Spirit, then we trust that we are being reordered and reoriented and brought into alignment with the heart of that God. And that's transcendent. We don't know all of what is happening to us.
Right. I think this, recognizing the significance of what is happening in that Sunday morning corporate worship space, I mean, for me, it puts so much more weight on things like the kind of songs that we pick, the kind of songs we write, the kind of things that we communicate in that space. Like, that to me is like, God, it's so important. It makes everything so important. And so I wonder, even just like speaking a little bit to that, of like the idea of, I'm not sure how many folks, I mean, you mentioned earlier, that's, I think many of our stories, many of us who've ended up, on a platform leading worship in churches, we've gotten there because we have some kind of musical gifting, and, people in church find out about it and they're like, oh, great, get on stage and lead worship. But we don't have much theological training, spiritual formation background, all that. And so we don't naturally think about things like the fact that every time we open our mouth, or every time we choose a song, or every time we say a prayer or anything, that we're actually shaping our congregation's theology.
Yes,
like
absolutely.
That's massive.
Yeah.
And all of that is leading into like this conversation. I'm not sure how many worship leaders are really thinking that and like recognizing the weight of the role that you carry in people's lives.
Absolutely. I think there is a holy weight, and then there is a crushing weight, which we've had conversations about before, the number of worship leaders that want to quit. I forget whether it was Saturday or Monday morning. There is a way of carrying that weight that is crushing, and it's not your weight to bear. But there is a weight that, whether you're preaching or leading worship or administering the sacraments or whatever you're doing, if you are leading the people of God in a moment with authority, and especially a microphone, pointing people to God. I mean, based off all the stuff we've said in this conversation, the content of our worship absolutely matters. And I believe ideas have consequences, especially our ideas about God, who we think we're called to be, what we think we're supposed to do with our lives, how we're supposed to deal with our time and money and relationships. Like, all of those things flow from what we really believe to be true about God. So yeah, content matters, and form matters. Like, how we do these things matters too. Not just, I'm praying these crafted prayers that were crafted 600 years ago, so I can just be sure that formation is automatically happening. It's like, the content matters and the form matters. Like, this is a conversation that perhaps we shouldn't get too deep in today, but everything is communicating something, from the architecture of the stage to what the lights look like, the dynamics of the music, what the pastor wears when he preaches, how flippant and casual or reverent, or all of these things. And I'm not trying to make judgments about any of them, but recognize how we do these things is communicating something. If our church sanctuary looks and feels multi-purpose for the sake of, we don't want it to be confined to being a sanctuary, That's communicating something to people about what the church is called to be and what the church is. So it's about content. Yes, it has an incredible amount of power to form people. And also the way that we deliver, the way that we call people to participate. Like one example, I'll just use the call to worship. So in most of our churches, the opening words are like, thank you so much for being here, which is not wrong. I think I do that often. But historically, there is an invocation there at the beginning of the service, liturgically called a call to worship, which reminds the people that God is initiating the service and calling them to attention, that they have been invited into that space by no one less than the living God. It reminds people, you didn't get here just by your own volition. Yes, of course, you are responding. But once again, God is doing more than you know. You are here because God has drawn you here, and he's calling us to attention as his people. That's really different than, hey guys, thanks so much for being here. Man, it's cold outside. Like, man, the Broncos stunk last week or whatever. And I'm not saying that there's not a place for humor. I think God has a great sense of humor. But who are we? Are we thanking people because they were so gracious to grace us with their presence? Yeah. That's not what corporate worship is about. Right. It's we are all here, from pastor to everybody, because God has invited us to be with him as his people. That sets a different tenor for the service. And I think that's the right tenor. It can even be done a couple of different ways, but it's just another way of thinking thoughtfully about everything that we're doing and where is it placing attention? How is it forming people when I do this? You know, so that's just one example, but.
Yeah. And it's really helpful, I think, to step back and have conversations like this that are thinking more about the big picture of all of this, because I think, like most everyone in the world right now, we can very easily get caught up in our own rhythms and all the things that demand our attention. And we get caught up in all of it, and we can very quickly just not think about those things. But I did want to ask you, like, as we wrap up the conversation, if you have any just final thoughts that you want to share as we wrap up the conversation about this. I think we've done a good job of hitting the Sunday morning, like the impacts of that on Sunday morning. But if there's anything you want to close with there, I mean,
the one thing, this thought occurred to me a minute ago. I would say it can feel, if you take this conversation seriously, which I have tried to do throughout the last number of years of my life, and it's very important to me, it can feel condemning, like, oh my gosh, I've been doing this wrong, or holy crap, how am I leading people into the presence of the living God, or it's really easy to carry a weight that is not yours to carry. Yeah. And it's also really easy for the tasks to feel daunting. Like, I don't know near enough about God. I got to go read, I got to go to seminary and I got to do all these things, which maybe you are called to do. And I am a big proponent of, if you feel called to a life of ministry in a vocational setting, seminary is really important. Yeah. It's not the end all be all. But here's what I would say. There is no silver bullet to get it all right. The closest thing that there is a fascination with Jesus. That at the end of the day, you can read all the books, you can sing the best songs, you can receive communion every week, you can confess your sins every day, that there are a lot of things that we can do that are right and still not be transformed and still not be rightly oriented to Jesus. But I think what we can all do is pray, Holy Spirit, draw me into a greater fascination with Jesus. And then from there, the prayers snowball. Give me a heart for his people. Give me a heart to follow you, Holy Spirit. Give me a heart to love the word. And before you know it, you're in love with God, and you're seeking out all of the ways that God tends to reveal himself through his people in the Sunday morning service, in the proclamation of the gospel, at the table, through singing. Like, you'll just care more because you love God and you love his people more. So I would say, if you're feeling any kind of condemnation or pressure, or this mountain is just too big, just pray prayers that God would draw you closer particularly I think to Jesus. Like, ask God to give you a fascination and a deep love for Jesus, and trust that and see where that takes you on your journey.
Yeah, that's good. And this really is all a journey.
It's a journey. Yeah, it's a journey. I bet 10 years from now, I'm going to be like, I can't believe I said that. But
I think all of us can probably relate to that sentiment. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I know this has been a really helpful conversation for me to think about and wrestle with. I hope it has been helpful for those of you listening as well, as we are all on this journey together to love and follow Jesus better and learn how to lead worship more thoughtfully and faithfully. Thanks again so much for joining us. Be sure to keep up with us on social media, subscribe to the 10,000 Fathers and Mothers podcast, and if you are a worship leader who is interested in being discipled, journeying along with us in worship school, we do have over 500 alumni at this point who are leading worship for over 250,000 people around the world. We would love to journey with you. We would love to get to know you and your story. So reach out to us through our website, 10kfam.org. If you think that there's any chance that worship school could be the next step in your journey, we would love to see you out here in Colorado Springs for an intensive.